Welcome to Disturbed Intent, the place where the past is never silent, the shadows still whisper, and true crime is told with the depth, respect, and intensity it deserves. Here, we peel back layers of forgotten stories, expose the truths buried beneath decades of dust, and walk you through the cases that shaped entire generations. Every detail matters, every moment counts, every story leaves an imprint. If you haven't already, take a second to like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new deep dive documentary. Your support keeps the stories alive and keeps Disturbed Intent growing. Now, settle in, take a breath, because what you're about to hear is not just a case. It's a haunting piece of history, one that begins on a cold winter morning in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and unfolds into a mystery that would linger for nearly half a century. This is Disturbed Intent, and this is the story. On a cold Tuesday morning, January 7th, 1969, the winter sun over Cambridge, Massachusetts rose without ceremony, the kind of pale, washed-out daylight that never truly warms the city. Students hurried across Harvard Square, boots skidding on patches of black ice that clung stubbornly to the sidewalks. Inside the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, the air was quiet except for the scratch of pencil on paper. It was exam day. A day that every doctoral candidate secretly dreaded. A day that would, for one student, become the last she would ever miss. And as always, before we dive in, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Disturbed Intent. It helps more than you know. Now, let's return to that morning. The morning everything changed. At around 12 noon, 27-year-old Harvard archaeology student James Humphreys stepped out of an exam room, fingers stiff from hours of writing. These were his general examinations, the final, brutal rite of passage before a doctoral student could begin a dissertation full-time. But the relief he expected never came. Something was wrong. Someone was missing. Someone who should have been sitting in that same room, writing those same answers, breathing that same nervous, recycled air. Her name was Jane Britton, a talented 23-year-old archaeology student, brilliant, driven, warm, and deeply respected by her peers, the kind of person whose path seemed set for success from her first day at Radcliffe College. She was supposed to be there. She was supposed to be nervous. She was supposed to walk out of the exam room beside him. But Jane never arrived. James had tried calling her twice earlier that morning, once before the exam, once just after it began, but both times the phone rang into an uncharacteristic silence. At first, he convinced himself she had simply overslept, that she was running late, that she had missed his calls because she was rushing out the door. But by noon, reality was far more chilling. Jane hadn't shown up at all, and James was the first to sense that something wasn't right. The 15-minute walk from the museum to Jane's apartment building on University Road felt endless. Snow crunched beneath James's shoes, and a biting draft carved its way through his coat. He tried to steady his breathing, but each step made the silence between his heartbeats a little louder. Jane was a perfectionist. Jane was punctual. Jane had been nervous about those exams the night before. They had spent the previous evening together, dinner with friends, followed by a bit of ice skating at Cambridge Common. She had seemed excited, focused, ready. She wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't just skip something so important. When James reached number 6 University Road, he pushed inside the old building, its interior corridors dim and stale. The place had a reputation creaking floorboards, erratic heating, and locks that worked more as decoration than protection. He hurried up to the 4th floor, heart pounding. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. But his knocking wasn't ignored. The sound stirred someone else. A door to his left opened, and Don Mitchell, a friend of Jane's and one half of the friendly couple who lived next door to her, poked his head out. "James?" Don said, surprised. He'd assumed the footsteps belonged to Jane. James explained. Jane had missed her exams. She hadn't answered her phone. He was worried. Don's expression shifted quickly, confusion, then concern. He told James to try the door. After all, Jane rarely locked it. Almost nobody in the building did. Not because they trusted the neighborhood, but because the locks barely worked at all. James turned the knob. It opened, and that's when the cold air hit him. A sharp, unnatural chill that didn't belong inside a heated apartment. the kind of cold that makes the hairs on your arms rise instinctively. A kitchen window was open, wide open. Snowy air seeped through the gap. The curtains fluttered gently. James stepped inside cautiously. The apartment was messy, not unusually so. Dishes out, books stacked, papers scattered. The typical signs of a graduate student in the middle of exam week. Nothing seemed broken. Nothing seemed stolen. Nothing suggested a disturbance. Until he reached the bedroom doorway. And then, time stopped. Jane appeared to be lying face down on her bed, her nightgown pushed up toward her waist. She wasn't moving. She wasn't responding. She looked like someone who had collapsed mid-sleep or fainted unexpectedly. James froze. Something about the scene felt deeply wrong, so wrong that he couldn't bring himself to go further. Instead, he ran back to the hall and called out for Don, asking him to get Jill, Don's wife. If Jane was undressed, he didn't think it would be appropriate for him to check her first. Jill entered the apartment. 10 seconds later, she came racing back out, trembling, hand over her mouth. She didn't need words. Her face said everything. Now panicking, Don rushed inside. He stepped into the bedroom, heart hammering against his ribs. He saw a sheepskin rug. He saw a fur coat. He saw them not on the floor, but on top of Jane. Someone had covered her head. Don lifted the coat, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jane wasn't sleeping. She wasn't fainted. She wasn't breathing. She was dead, and brutally so. When Don Mitchell stepped into Jane Britton's bedroom that cold January afternoon, he was not prepared, not mentally, not emotionally, not in any way to absorb what had happened behind that half-closed door. Jane lay face down across her bed. Her nightgown was bunched high around her waist. Bed sheets were twisted around her legs as if she had either moved during the attack or been adjusted afterward. The sheepskin rug and fur coat had been placed directly over her head, deliberately, almost ceremonially. It took Don 1 second to understand. Jane was gone. She had been killed. And not gently, not quietly, not mercifully. He staggered backward, heart pounding so hard he felt it in his throat. His voice caught when he finally managed to speak. Call the police. It was all he could say. He could feel Jill behind him, hovering at the doorway, her eyes wide with shock, her hands shaking. James, standing in the hall, didn't need to hear details. He could read the truth in Don's trembling voice. Emergency services were contacted immediately. The dispatcher's tone was calm and practiced. But the tension between the three witnesses, James, Don, and Jill, was nearly suffocating. Every second that passed felt unreal, as though they had accidentally stepped into someone else's nightmare. The police would arrive in minutes, and with them, the brutal unraveling of a mystery that would remain unsolved for nearly half a century. Detectives from the Cambridge Police Department arrived swiftly, their boots echoing through the stairwell as they climbed to the 4th floor. The building at number 6 University Road had never felt smaller, its narrow hallways suddenly impressive. What met the officers inside Jane's apartment was a crime scene that was, in many ways, the worst kind, both violent and eerily clean. No broken furniture, no obvious signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no overturned lamps, no screaming neighbors, no cries for help, only the open window, only the cold air, only the silence of a place that had seen everything. Investigators found Jane still positioned face down on her bed, her head and face savagely injured. Blood had dried into dark, murky stains across the pillowcase and mattress. The wounds, deep contusions, vicious lacerations, suggested repeated blows with a sharp-edged or pointed object. Something small, something blunt, something like a pick hammer, or even a small hatchet, but the weapon was nowhere to be found. The medical examiner would later conclude that Jane died from blunt force trauma to the skull, delivered with intense, unrelenting force. At least one blow had cracked bone. Whoever killed her had done it with rage, and with precision, and without fear of being heard. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Jane had been sexually assaulted. Police kept that detail from the public at first. It was too volatile, too raw, too dangerous in the hands of sensationalist newspapers that had already begun circling outside the building like vultures. This was no random accident. This was a targeted attack. Police interviewed everyone who had seen or spoken to Jane in the final hours before her death. He told detectives about their date the previous night. dinner with friends, ice skating at Cambridge Common afterward, returning to her apartment at around 10:30 at night, leaving around 11:30. Everything seemed normal when he left. No strange behavior, no odd sounds, no fear, no sense of danger. James insisted Jane locked her windows at night, but her kitchen window, now open, told a different story. The Mitchells confirmed that Jane had visited their apartment shortly after James left. They shared a drink, some sherry, and chatted briefly. Jane seemed excited about her exam the next morning, but also nervous. Typical nerves. Nothing dark, nothing ominous. She left their apartment around 12:30 in the morning. That would be the last time either of them saw her alive. Police used these timestamps to estimate Jane's time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning. But there were two more witnesses. The superintendent's daughter said she heard strange noises on the fire escape around 9 in the evening hours before Jane returned home. Metal scraping, footsteps. Investigators debated the significance. If someone had climbed the fire escape at 9, why didn't Jane and James notice anything when they arrived home after 10:30? Why didn't the Mitchells hear anything earlier in the evening? Or did the noises belong to someone testing the building, watching, scouting, a man living nearby, or in some accounts, a local transit worker claimed he saw someone running from the building around 1:30 in the morning. A man around 6 feet tall, roughly 170 pounds, running fast, running with purpose, running in the rain. Was it the killer? Or simply someone trying to escape the storm? Police couldn't agree. When investigators searched the apartment, they were shocked by how little seemed disturbed. Nothing had been stolen. Her wallet remained untouched. Jewelry was in its place. Her cat and pet turtle were unharmed. No drawers opened. No shelves knocked over. No forced entry. No shattered glass. This was no burglary. No robbery gone wrong. No random break-in. This was intimate, deliberate, the kind of crime committed by someone who either knew Jane or had studied her patterns closely enough to know when she would be alone. And then there was the coat, the fur coat placed over her head, not thrown, not dropped, but placed. Some killers cover the faces of victims they feel shame toward. Others arrange scenes symbolically. Some try to hide what they've done from themselves. Police noticed something else. Red ochre, a reddish-brown powder used by artists and by ancient civilizations in burial rituals. It was scattered across parts of the room. Some of it was found near Jane's body. The newspapers leapt on that detail instantly, before police could control it. They spun it into a sensational theory. Had the killer performed a ritual? Was the murderer someone from the archaeology department? Someone who knew the cultural meaning of red ochre? Police hated that idea. They hated how quickly it spread. They hated how it turned a brutal killing into a myth. But there was no denying the powder was there. And no denying that it was strange. Was it a clue? Or a distraction? Or something else entirely? At this stage of the investigation, no one could say. Within hours, news vans swarmed outside the apartment building. The murder of a young, talented Harvard student, especially one from a well-known academic family, was big news. Jane's father, J. Boyd Britton, was a respected administrator at Radcliffe College. Her mother, Ruth, was a scholar as well. Their daughter was beloved in academic circles. Journalists fought tooth and nail for every detail, every rumor, every whisper. Harvard's reputation was suddenly under a spotlight it did not want. Reporters dug into building conditions at 6 University Road, and what they found was damning. Residents complained that the building's heating system was unpredictable. Locks on doors rarely worked. Windows were loose or stuck. Security was practically non-existent. Anyone could walk in from the street. Doors were left unlocked out of habit, not safety. And then came the most disturbing detail. Another woman had been murdered in the same building years earlier. Her name was Beverly Sammons. She had been killed in 1963, just 2 floors below Jane's apartment. The crime had been pinned on Albert DeSalvo, the so-called Boston Strangler, but even then, many questioned whether DeSalvo had actually committed every murder he confessed to. Now, with Jane's case echoing that earlier tragedy, people began to panic. Was there a serial offender tied to the building? Had something been missed? Had Harvard failed to protect its own students? Police publicly insisted the 2 murders were not connected, but privately, the similarities made them uneasy. Despite the intensity of the investigation, few viable leads emerged. Police performed lie detector tests on James Humphreys, Don and Jill Mitchell, one other unnamed individual. All passed. Jane's friends and family were thoroughly vetted. None raised suspicion. None had motive. None fit the emerging pattern. But then came what investigators hoped would be the break. Unknown fingerprints were found inside the apartment. They belonged to no one in Jane's life. Not James. Not the Mitchells. Not her family. Not her friends. Not her professors. A stranger had been inside her apartment. A stranger had touched something. A stranger had left behind a mark. But fingerprints alone could not solve a murder, not in 1969. The technology wasn't there. The databases didn't exist. The trail was already cooling. Investigators held press conferences early on, honest ones. They admitted frustration, admitted confusion, admitted they did not yet understand why this had happened. "If only we had something to hold on to," one detective told reporters. "If only we had a handle." They didn't know that the case was about to take a turn that would make everything worse, a turn that would bury the truth for decades. The moment a single reporter printed the words "ancient ritual," the floodgates opened. Suddenly, every newspaper from Boston to California wanted the details. Was red ochre sprinkled on Jane as part of a ceremonial act? Did the killer know her studies? Was the murder symbolic? Were archaeology students involved? Was someone performing a macabre reenactment? Reporters crafted headlines dripping with implication. Harvard ritual murder. Ancient burial powder found at crime scene. Is a scholar behind the killing? Detectives were furious. The theory was dangerous, not just sensational. It painted an entire department as suspects. It terrified graduate students. It diverted attention. It twisted public perception. Cambridge Police Chief James Reagan reacted immediately. He imposed a full news blackout. No more statements. No updates. No interviews. No clarifications. Anything released from that point forward had to be approved by his office. Silence replaced transparency. The public grew restless. Students whispered theories in hallways. Professors felt eyes on them. Journalists hunted for leaks. And in that swirling chaos, the true killer slipped further into the shadows. The order for silence from the police chief changed everything. What had begun as a chaotic but somewhat transparent investigation snapped shut almost overnight. Journalists who had been feeding on the case like an electrical current suddenly found themselves cut off from power. No statements, no clarifications, no reassurance that progress was being made. The rumor about red ochre had already spread far beyond what investigators were comfortable with, and now the vacuum of information made it grow even faster. Students whispered that the killer must be someone in the department. Others insisted it had to be a stranger with an obsession for ancient rituals. Some wondered if it had been someone who attended the archaeological dig with Jane the previous summer. The narrative changed every hour because there was no official voice to ground the truth, just silence and fear and speculation. Inside the police department, detectives kept turning over every piece of information they had, but none of it came together. They knew Jane had returned home around 12:30 in the morning. They knew James had left around 11:30 the night before. They knew the kitchen window was open when the body was discovered, and that a witness had reported hearing something on the fire escape around 9 in the evening. But nothing about those scattered pieces made a clear picture. If someone had climbed the fire escape earlier that night, why did James see nothing unusual when he left? Why did Jane seem relaxed enough to drink with neighbors before going to bed? And if the killer came later after 1 in the morning, why did no one hear anything at all? The building was old. The walls were thin. The floors creaked under the lightest footsteps. Yet not a single neighbor recalled a noise that matched the violent attack Jane suffered. Still, detectives refused to dismiss the scene as a perfect crime. They were convinced there had to be something they were missing. Something small, something easily overlooked. Something that, if flipped over or placed in the right spot, would suddenly illuminate everything. But day after day passed with no such revelation. The fingerprints belonged to no one in their system. The missing stone, initially believed to be the potential weapon, was later found inside the apartment, eliminating what had been their only promising lead. And the open window remained a question mark. Was it the intruder's entry point, Or was it simply open because the building was overheated, and residents often cracked their windows to allow in cold air? Meanwhile, reporters kept the story alive even with the blackout in place. They published features about Jane's life, her time at Radcliffe, her promising academic future, her talent in painting, her love for archaeology, and the expedition she had joined in Iran the previous summer. They highlighted her family's standing within the academic world, emphasizing the tragedy not simply as a murder, but as the loss of a brilliant mind. Her professors described her as gifted, passionate, and endlessly curious. Her classmates said she was warm, personable, and determined. Her parents remained dignified, though shaken, trying to honor their daughter's memory while enduring the relentless attention that came with her death. And beneath all those tributes lay a growing fear that the killer might be closer than anyone wanted to believe. For the residents of 6 University Road, the fear was suffocating. Many of them were young women, living alone or with roommates, juggling academic pressures with the realities of city life. Jane's death shattered the illusion of safety in the building. The loose locks and drafty windows suddenly felt like open invitations to danger. Neighbors complained loudly that the university had neglected the building's security for years, and now someone had taken advantage of those vulnerabilities. The building doors often failed to latch. Visitors could walk in without being questioned. Fire escapes provided easy access to upper floors. It felt, one resident said, like the building had been designed for someone to commit a crime and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. That fear grew into anger when old news clippings resurfaced about the earlier murder inside the same building. Beverly Sammons, a graduate student living 2 floors below Jane, had been murdered in 1963. Although that crime had unofficially been attributed to Albert DeSalvo, the man who confessed to being the Boston Strangler, many doubted his guilt in that particular case. The similarities were unsettling. A young woman living alone, a building with poor security, and a brutal attack committed inside an apartment that showed no signs of forced entry. The idea that 2 women had been murdered in the same building just 6 years apart, it felt impossible to ignore. Police insisted the 2 cases were unrelated. DeSalvo had been incarcerated by the time Jane was killed. Yet the reassurance rang hollow for many. If one murder could happen there, why not another? And if it wasn't the Boston Strangler, who else had been wandering the halls of that building back in 1963? That unanswered question created a long, uncomfortable shadow that stretched across both investigations. Inside the police station, detectives were growing exhausted. They interviewed dozens of people. They checked every name in Jane's contact lists. They spoke to former romantic partners, classmates, professors, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances. Nothing pointed to a clear suspect. Jane had no known enemies, no stalkers, no grudges, no conflicts that people could recall. Her life seemed filled with friends, schoolwork, and the typical stresses of graduate study. Nothing in her life hinted at the horror she faced in those final moments. Yet the brutality of the attack made investigators certain this was not a simple crime of opportunity. Whoever did this targeted Jane. They waited, they entered, and they attacked with a focused rage that suggested intent. She had been bludgeoned repeatedly with force strong enough to fracture bone. She had been sexually assaulted, and someone had taken the time to cover her head afterward. That detail bothered detectives more than almost anything else. Covering a victim's face often indicates guilt or remorse, but it can also suggest ritual, symbolism, or a desire to distance oneself from the violence. And then there was the red ochre. It was found in several places inside the room, though not in large quantities. Some appeared near the bed, some on the floor, a trace on the rug, perhaps even on Jane herself. At first, everyone assumed it had something to do with her artwork. Jane painted often. She kept supplies scattered throughout her apartment. Many pigments were natural minerals, including red ochre. In an ordinary context, that explanation would have been enough. But in the context of murder, it became something much darker. Red ochre has been used in burial rites across ancient cultures. From Paleolithic graves to early societies in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the pigment often symbolized life, blood, protection, or purification. Its presence in a murder scene involving an archaeology student seemed too symbolic to ignore. Newspapers latched onto that connection immediately, and speculation spiraled out of control before police could contain it. Some believed the killer sprinkled it deliberately as a twisted archaeological gesture. Others thought it was part of an elaborate staging meant to taunt investigators or mimic ancient rituals. A small group even suspected the killer might have been someone jealous of Jane's academic achievements or angry about something that had occurred during the Iran expedition. Detectives found themselves chasing rumors rather than evidence. The blackout was intended to stop the chaos, but by then, the chaos was already out in the world. Despite the silence enforced by the department, the community grew restless. Students protested the lack of information. Residents of the building demanded security upgrades. Concerned parents called the university, demanding to know whether their daughters were safe. And Harvard, unwilling to be publicly tied to the scandal, struggled to maintain calm while distancing itself from responsibility. Weeks passed. No arrests were made. No suspects publicly named. No major developments reached the public. The case, once a daily headline, slowly sank beneath the weight of other news stories. Though the unease never fully disappeared. People still remembered the open window. They still remembered the unknown fingerprints. They still remembered the witness who saw a man running from the building around 1:30 in the morning. They still remembered the coat over Jane's head. They still remembered the red ochre. And then, early the next month, fear returned with a vengeance. Another woman was murdered in Cambridge. Her name was Ada Bean. She lived less than a mile from Jane's apartment. She, too, was found in her bed. She, too, had been bludgeoned in the head. She, too, appeared to have been attacked while sleeping. Her nightgown had been pulled up. A blanket was placed over her head. The similarities were undeniable, and the panic that erupted in the community was immediate. Admitting the connection publicly would have set the city on fire. Detectives chose their words carefully, acknowledging the surface similarities but refusing to confirm any link. They insisted the crimes could still be unrelated, but privately, investigators felt a growing sense of dread. 2 women, 2 brutal attacks, 2 staged scenes, 2 neighborhoods barely separated by a short walk, and no answers. The weight of expectation fell heavily on law enforcement. Harvard alumni were calling. The mayor's office was calling. Newspapers were demanding comment. Families were demanding protection. The silence that once shielded the investigation now suffocated it, pressing harder on detectives with each passing day. With no breakthroughs and no direction, prosecutors convened a grand jury in hopes that formal testimony might reveal something overlooked. They questioned witnesses, reviewed timelines, examined evidence, and pushed for any detail that might break the stalemate. But the proceedings dragged on without resolution. The jury never even reached a vote. The panel dissolved. The momentum died with it. And the unsolved killing of Jane Britton slowly slipped from public consciousness. By the end of that year, the case was fading into the background of Cambridge history, overshadowed by other crimes, other tragedies, other headlines. But for those who had known Jane, the wound never closed. For her parents, the loss was unimaginable. For James, the guilt of missing her final moments never left him. For the Mitchells, the memory of that day haunted their lives. And for investigators, the case remained an unsolved failure, a reminder that even meticulous work can crumble in the face of scarce evidence and overwhelming silence. As the years turned into decades, hope dimmed. The world changed, technology evolved, the people involved aged, many retired, some passed away, and Jane's murder sat inside boxes and folders, gathering dust in evidence rooms and archives. Yet, even dormant, the case never truly died. It lingered like a whisper, like a chill crawling up a spine on a winter evening. It waited for someone persistent enough or obsessed enough to reach back into those boxes and stir the dust until the truth began to rise again. And eventually, someone did. The murder of Jane Britton had stopped commanding headlines. Students who once whispered her name in dormitories now whispered about exams, research grants, and campus gossip. The world of 1969 moved quickly, swallowing tragedies whole. But inside certain offices, and inside the hearts of the people who knew her, the silence was different. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that follows you, the kind that sits beside you in the dark. Investigators had done everything they knew to do. They sifted through Jane's writings, They retraced her steps from the days before her death. They read her letters, her journals, her field notes. They dug through her apartment for any hidden clue, something tucked between books, slipped into drawers, pressed beneath canvases. They looked for anything that might reveal a secret relationship, a jealous classmate, a disgruntled acquaintance, a stranger who might have crossed paths with her during the Iran expedition. But Jane's life contained nothing sinister. She was studious, social, focused. She had fears, but none out of the ordinary. No stalkers, no obsessive suitors, no threatening letters. Nothing that placed a target on her back. The lack of answers frustrated detectives, but it tormented her family and friends. Jane had been 23, an age where dreams feel limitless and the future seems spread out like a horizon waiting to be crossed. She had been planning to continue her work with Near Eastern archaeology, perhaps even return to Iran. She loved painting, horseback riding, hiking, the companionship of her peers, and the excitement of discovering things buried for thousands of years. And yet, her story had been reduced to a collection of evidence photographs, transcripts, and a timeline ending just after 12:30 on a winter morning. Her parents made repeated trips between Cambridge and their home in New Jersey, each visit marked by the painful ritual of speaking to detectives, hoping for progress, only to return home with nothing but condolences and vague assurances that the investigation was ongoing. They tried to stay strong, tried to honor their daughter's memory with grace. But grief is a tide that drags even the strongest swimmers under, and each day that passed with no answer added another invisible stone to the weight they carried. James Humphreys carried his own stones, ones born not of guilt in the legal sense, but of the deeply human sense. He replayed their final night over and over in his mind. Could he have stayed longer? Should he have insisted she lock her door? Should he have noticed something unusual, some subtle warning, some sign of danger? The police cleared him quickly, but the weight of being the last one to see her alive binds itself to a person's memory in ways that never fully fade. He finished his degree. He built a life, but the shadow of that night remained lodged somewhere quiet and permanent. The Mitchells, who had lived just one wall away from Jane, found themselves transformed overnight. What had once been a young couple's cozy apartment turned into a place haunted by the memory of a moment they never asked for. Dawn had been the one to lift the coat, to see the truth firsthand, to shout for help. Jill had been the one who felt nausea rise the moment she stepped into the room. They moved out not long after, unable to stay in a place where safety had been shattered so violently. But leaving the building didn't free them from the memory. It followed, soft but persistent, like the faint echo of footsteps on an old wooden floor. Outside of Jane's immediate circle, the case remained frozen. Without new evidence, the files sat untouched for long stretches. Detectives rotated in and out of the department. New ones inherited the case, studied the materials, drew the same conclusions, and eventually moved on. The old photograph of Jane, smiling, bright-eyed, hopeful, stared out from dozens of file covers, silently challenging each new investigator to solve what the last had not. But with no suspect, no meaningful leads, and no new technology to push the case forward, the challenge went unanswered. Then came the 1970s. A decade of change, protests, social upheaval, technological leaps, and failures. But not for cases like Jane's. Criminal investigations still relied heavily on eyewitnesses, fingerprints, handwriting samples, and confessions. Without them, cases died. And Jane's case was slipping into the gray space between unresolved and forgotten. Detectives had not forgotten the case of Ada Bean either. The similarities between the two attacks had shaken them deeply. The staging, the time of night, the brutality, the geographic proximity, quietly, off record. More than one investigator admitted they believed the two cases were connected. But belief is not evidence, and evidence was the one thing they lacked. Without it, the murder of Ada Bean drifted down the same path as Jane's into silence. It would take years, decades, before the quiet began to crack. In the early 1990s, two state police detectives reviewing old files made a surprising discovery. Despite the passage of more than 20 years, some of the biological evidence collected from Jane's autopsy and bedding had been preserved. DNA testing was still in its early stages, used mostly in high-profile or recent cases. But the existence of preserved biological matter, especially in a case involving sexual assault, was enough to reawaken interest. The detectives arranged for a DNA test. The process was not what it would become decades later. It was slower, less precise, limited in scope, but it was still powerful compared to the tools available in 1969. When the results came back, investigators felt the first spark of hope they had experienced in years. There was DNA. Not Jane's, not James's, not any friend or acquaintance. A third profile, a stranger. It should have been a turning point, but DNA databases were still in their infancy. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, had only recently been established, and it contained far fewer samples than it would in later decades. When the detectives submitted the unknown profile, they hoped for a miracle. None came. There was no match. The spark of hope fizzled into frustration. The case retreated into the cold again, though this time with a tiny ember alive beneath the ashes. The 1990s became the early 2000s. Advances in technology exploded across nearly every field. Personal computers replaced typewriters. The internet connected cities and continents instantly, and forensic science made leaps that would have seemed like fiction to investigators in 1969. DNA analysis grew more sophisticated. Detection methods improved. Databases expanded dramatically as states began mandating the collection of DNA from convicted offenders. Yet the DNA from Jane's case sat in storage, waiting. Then, in 2006, investigators arranged for a retest. The sample was small, almost dangerously so, but advancements meant more could be extracted and examined. Hopes rose again. And again, results came back with the same conclusion: no match. The unidentified male profile still sat alone in the database, unconnected to any known criminal. By this point, many investigators assumed the case would never be solved. Even with DNA in hand, a match required that the perpetrator's profile be entered into CODIS at some point. If the killer had died, left the state, or simply never been arrested for a qualifying crime, his profile may never appear. The answer might remain out of reach forever. But time has a strange way of changing the shape of truth. And while the case drifted, something else began to stir, something outside the police department, outside the courthouse, far beyond the walls of 6 University Road. It began with curiosity. A student at Harvard in 2009, 40 years after the murder, heard whispers about an unsolved killing involving a former archaeology student, a young woman who had been talented and beloved, a case involving red ochre. A case involving secrecy, half-truths, and unending silence. Her name was Becky Cooper. She didn't know it yet, but she would become one of the central figures in the story that followed. Her interest in the case wasn't rooted in sensationalism or thrill-seeking. It was rooted in something much deeper: the desire to understand why a story like Jane's had been swallowed by the institution she once called home. She wanted to know why people stopped talking about it, why the truth seemed fractured, and why rumors seemed to have more life than the official version of events. Becky tried to gather information. She talked to alumni, she spoke to former professors, she dug through archives, hunting for anything not sealed away in police files. But what she found was a labyrinth: whispers about department politics, theories about jealousy, stories about favoritism. None of it aligned neatly. None of it could be trusted. And yet, the deeper she went, the more convinced she became that Jane's murder had cast a long shadow over the department, one that no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. Years later, after graduating, Becky continued investigating the case. She wasn't alone. Another man, far older than Becky and far more connected to the original case, also found himself pulled back into the story. His name was Michael Widmer. In 1969, he had been a young reporter at United Press International, barely 2 days into the job, when he was assigned to cover the murder of Jane Britton. It was his first major story, and it stayed with him. By the time he retired decades later, the memory had only grown sharper. Something about the case had never sat right with him, and he felt compelled to revisit it. He began requesting records, digging through old articles, and pushing for transparency from the Middlesex District Attorney's Office. Widmer and Cooper did not know each other at first. They worked independently, unaware that they were both pulling at the same thread. But their actions triggered something the authorities had not anticipated. Multiple people, students, journalists, and true crime researchers began filing public records requests for the files related to Jane's murder. These requests arrived year after year, from different names, different cities, different states. Each request demanded the same thing: the truth. The DA's office resisted. Every request was denied. The reason was always the same: releasing information could jeopardize an open investigation. But this justification grew weaker with each passing decade. The case had not been active for years. The public had the right to know. There was no suspect, no active pursuit, no motion in the dark. Defense lawyers, legal scholars, and journalists began pointing out that the secrecy surrounding the case appeared less about protecting justice and more about protecting institutional reputation. And the more the DA's office refused, the louder the questions grew. Why fight so hard to conceal information from a case that was older than the prosecutors themselves? What was being hidden? What truth had been buried beneath nearly 50 years of silence? Becky Cooper, frustrated but not defeated, kept pushing. Widmer, seasoned and patient, kept filing legal motions. Others joined them. Lawsuits followed. The courts ruled slowly, one agonizing inch at a time. Under pressure, the DA's office finally began reviewing the evidence again, not because they wanted to, but because they needed to prove the investigation was still active in order to legally justify withholding the files. And that decision, born not from pursuit of justice, but from administrative necessity, became the catalyst for the breakthrough. When the evidence was resubmitted for DNA testing in 2018, the technology had advanced far beyond anything available in 2006. More importantly, the CODIS database had grown enormously, holding millions of offender profiles that had not been present during earlier searches. This time, the system responded. A match appeared. A name, a new name, a name investigators had never considered. The man who had murdered Jane Britton had been identified at last. The name that appeared on the DNA report in 2018 was not one that investigators, reporters, or even longtime followers of the case had ever expected. It was not a professor, not a fellow archaeologist, not a disgruntled peer, not someone connected to Jane's academic world at all. The name belonged to a man whose life had followed an entirely different path, one marked not by research or scholarship, but by violence, crime, and a pattern of offenses that should have placed him on law enforcement's radar decades earlier. His name was Michael Sumter. To anyone who knew the history of violent crime in Massachusetts, the revelation was as shocking as it was deeply haunting. Sumter had been a convicted serial rapist, a predator who had targeted women around the Boston area throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. His crimes were brutal, persistent, and deliberate. He had attacked women in apartments, in alleyways, near parks, anywhere he could find vulnerability. But what made the discovery even more complicated was that Sumter had died in 2001 after being released from prison to hospice care while battling terminal cancer. The killer was dead. He had lived decades beyond Jane, decades beyond that cold night in 1969, long enough to harm others, long enough to evade justice, long enough to die without ever answering for what he had done. When investigators connected the DNA to Sumter, the room reportedly fell silent. The match was strong, scientifically undeniable. The profile taken from the biological evidence at the scene aligned with Sumter's stored DNA with absolute precision. There was no room for doubt. After nearly 50 years of questions, accusations, misdirection, and institutional silence, the truth had finally emerged. And it was a truth no one had predicted. Sumter had lived in Cambridge at various points in his life. He had worked near Harvard Square. He had been familiar with the area around University Road. In 1969, he had been 25 years old, only 2 years older than Jane herself. His physical description aligned eerily well with the witness who claimed to have seen a man running from the building at 1:30 in the morning on the night Jane was killed. The witness had described the individual as tall, lean, and moving quickly through the rain. Sumter matched that build. He matched the timing. He matched the profile. He matched the violence. What made everything even more disturbing was the realization that Sumter's DNA had previously linked him to 2 other unsolved murders, those of Ellen Rutchick in 1972 and Mary Lee McLean in 1973. Both victims were women. Both lived in the Boston area. Both were attacked inside their own homes. Both were found with signs of sexual assault and brutal force. The similarities to Jane's murder were impossible to ignore. Yet, despite the connections, decades had passed before anyone realized the full scope of his crimes. And in each of those cases, just like in Jane's, Sumter had slipped through the cracks, evading prosecution, evading detection, and evading justice. When the Middlesex District Attorney's Office announced the breakthrough, the public response was as complex as the case itself. On one hand, there was relief that the truth had finally been uncovered. Relief that Jane's family could finally have answers. Relief that the decades of confusion and speculation could finally end. But on the other hand, there was anger. Deep, festering anger. Anger that it had taken so long. Anger that the truth had been buried behind red ochre rumors and administrative secrecy. Anger that DNA had been available since the 1990s and had not been exploited sooner. Anger that the man responsible had lived a life unburdened by accountability, while Jane's memory remained frozen in time. For the people like Becky Cooper and Michael Widmer, who had spent years pushing for transparency, the revelation was bittersweet. They had wanted the truth. They had wanted justice. They had wanted closure for Jane's parents, for her friends, for everyone touched by her story. And they had helped bring attention back to a case that was drifting into obscurity. But they could not ignore that the truth came not from someone willingly reopening the case, but from public pressure, forcing the system to defend its secrecy. The discovery was not a triumph of justice. It was the result of persistent questioning, of refusal to stay silent, of people demanding answers when institutions refused to provide them. Even the district attorney herself acknowledged that advancing DNA technology had been the real key to the breakthrough. The CODIS database had expanded dramatically since earlier tests. Offender profiles that had not been present in 2006 were now included. And Sumter's DNA, collected after his later arrests in the 1970s, was finally available in a form that matched the profile collected from Jane's case. What began as a formality, proof that the case was still active, had forced the DA's office to look at the evidence again, and the result of that routine action had cracked open a mystery nearly half a century old. When the news reached Jane's surviving family members, the emotions that surfaced were unimaginable. Her parents had passed away long before the case was solved, never knowing the truth. But extended relatives and friends who remained alive spoke publicly about the mix of gratitude and heartbreak they felt. Gratitude that the killer had been identified. Heartbreak that it came too late for those who deserved answers most. For James Humphreys, who by then was an older man far removed from his student years, the confirmation brought back memories long buried. He had lived with the shadow of that night for most of his life. Now, finally, he knew the truth, that the horror that took Jane had not come from within her circle, not from someone she had invited into her apartment, not from some academic rivalry or complicated personal entanglement. It had come from a stranger who targeted her, stalked her, waited for an opportunity, and struck with calculated brutality. For Don and Jill Mitchell, the ones who discovered her, the announcement reopened a chapter they had never fully closed. The weight of memory resurfaced, but for the first time, it carried with it a name, a real, tangible name, a face, a past, a history, a truth. And in the presence of that truth, the memory changed shape. It became less about mystery and more about the reality of violence that had been lurking just beyond their walls. The details of what likely occurred that night became clearer through the lens of Sumter's known behavior. The D.A. pieced together a narrative based on the evidence, witness accounts, and Sumter's established pattern. They theorized that he had followed Jane home that night. Perhaps he had watched her return to the building. Perhaps he had waited for the lights inside to go dim. Perhaps he had seen James leave the apartment around 11:30. And then, when the moment seemed right, he climbed the fire escape. The testimony of the superintendent's daughter about footsteps heard on the fire escape around 9 in the evening took on new significance. Maybe Sumter had been surveying the building earlier, testing the window, checking the layout, choosing his point of entry. Maybe he left when he realized Jane wasn't inside yet, only to return hours later once the timing aligned. The open window that James had found when he entered the apartment now felt like the most telling clue of all. It was winter. The air was bitter. Jane rarely opened the window that wide. Investigators now believe Sumter had pried it open from the fire escape and slipped inside quietly, unseen and unheard. What happened inside the apartment likely played out in minutes, maybe even seconds. Jane had gone to bed, her nightgown positioned exactly the way she wore it when she slept. The bed linens were undisturbed, except for the area around her head. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been attacked while unconscious or barely awake. The brutality of the blows indicated rage or compulsion, not hesitation. The sexual assault followed, the covering of her head followed, and then Sumter fled, moving down the fire escape or slipping through the front door, blending into the dark, rainy night. When the witness saw a man running at 1:30 in the morning, soaked from the rain, that man may very well have been the killer. The red ochre, once the center of sensational theories, turned out to be nothing more than coincidence. Investigators concluded that Jane, being a painter, often used the pigment. It had likely been tracked or brushed onto surfaces in her apartment before the murder. There was no ritual, no symbolic gesture, no archaeological message, just a tragic, ordinary presence of an artist's materials in the apartment of an archaeology student. When the DA explained this publicly, some people felt disappointed that the mystery was less exotic, less arcane, less dramatic than they had imagined. But for Jane's supporters, the removal of myth was a relief. Her death had been twisted in the public imagination for too long. It was time for the truth to stand alone. The legacy of the case became something more complicated than a murder solved. It became a study in institutional silence, in the dangers of rumor-driven narratives, in the failure of early forensic limitations, and in the importance of persistence from investigators, from citizens, from journalists, and from those who refused to let a forgotten case fade into darkness. Jane's murder had been the oldest case ever solved in Middlesex County. Nearly 50 years of unanswered questions collapsed into one definitive result. But even with the truth revealed, there were questions that would never be answered. Why did Sumter choose Jane? Did he follow her from the museum? Did he stalk her earlier? Was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did he act alone or with prior intent? No one could say. And because Sumter had died years before the truth emerged, no one could ever ask him. As the world absorbed the truth, another question began to circulate, one that echoed the fears of 1969. Was Sumter responsible for the murder of Ada Bean? The similarities were uncanny, but without preserved DNA or direct evidence, investigators could not confirm it. They could not link him with certainty. And so Ada's case remained unresolved, caught in the same grip of mystery that had once held Jane's. The question of whether Michael Sumter was responsible for the murder of Ada Bean began to haunt investigators almost immediately after his name was announced. The parallels were too striking to dismiss outright. 2 women, 2 Cambridge apartments, 2 nighttime attacks. Both women found in their beds, both assaulted, both bludgeoned, both staged afterward with fabric covering their heads. The crimes were separated by only a matter of weeks. In the world of behavioral profiling, that proximity is rarely coincidence. Yet, without physical evidence linking him to Ada, the case remained suspended somewhere between suspicion and certainty. Investigators could do little more than acknowledge the possibility in private while maintaining public caution. Even so, the thought lingered. It lingered in the offices. It lingered in the public imagination. It lingered in the narrow hallways of old Cambridge apartment buildings, where women who remembered that winter still felt the chill of it decades later. If Sumter had killed Jane, and if he had killed Ada, what else had he done before the system finally caught up to him? How many lives intersected with his without ever knowing who he truly was? How many potential victims escaped him by chance alone? The tragedy of Jane's death was that everyone who loved her had to live inside that what if. What if she had left for her exam earlier? What if James had stayed a few minutes longer? What if the Mitchells had invited her to sleep on their couch? What if the window had been properly secured? What if the building had better locks? What if Harvard had taken the security complaints seriously? There is a cruelty in hindsight that few people can escape. When details of Sumter's history became public knowledge, the shock deepened. He had been arrested numerous times throughout the 1970s. His assaults were violent, calculated, and predatory. He selected women who were alone. He attacked with force. He displayed a pattern of escalating aggression. He blended into society just well enough to evade suspicion, but not so well that he could avoid the consequences forever. In an era when communication between jurisdictions was limited and record-keeping was fragmented, his crimes slipped between cracks large enough for a man like him to disappear into. If the DNA technology of 2018 had existed in 1978, Sumter's life would have been much shorter, his crimes much fewer. But the world was not built for that kind of justice then. It wasn't prepared. And because of that, Jane's life was taken by a man who should have been stopped long before he ever found his way to her apartment. When the final report was delivered to the public, the district attorney laid out the sequence of events as they believed it had occurred, piece by piece. They described the likely stalking, the fire escape entry, the silent approach into a darkened apartment, the weapon never found, the assault, the killing, the covering of her head, the sudden exit, the witness seeing a man fleeing through the rain at 1:30 in the morning, the long silence that followed. It was clinical, it was factual, it was necessary. But for everyone who had held on to hope for so long, it was also devastating. The truth had come, but the justice could not. The murderer was gone. The questions were permanent. The announcement made its way across newspapers, social media, and academic circles. For older Harvard alumni, the name Jane Britton resurfaced like a ghost from a past they believed they had left behind. For current students, the story became a window into a forgotten history, one with lessons about vulnerability, institutional responsibility, and the unpredictable nature of danger. For professors in the archaeology department, it reopened an uncomfortable chapter marked by rumors, shame, and unspoken wounds. The red ochre myth, once the centerpiece of sensational headlines, evaporated under the weight of scientific truth. Investigators publicly stated that the substance had no ritual significance whatsoever. It was simply art pigment, one of the many materials Jane kept in her apartment for her paintings. There was no symbolic burial rite, no ancient echo, no message from a killer reenacting a prehistoric custom. It had been an accident of narrative, a byproduct of human imagination in the absence of clarity. And like many myths, it had grown because it was easier to believe in drama than in randomness. Journalists revisiting the case, decades later, admitted that the red ochre detail had been blown out of proportion, fueled by the allure of a ritualistic angle. But the truth was simpler and far more tragic. Jane had been murdered, not by someone with an archaeological agenda, but by a predator who could have attacked anyone in his path. She was chosen because she was home, because she was alone, because he could reach her. That was the truth, and that truth, while less cinematic, was infinitely more terrifying. The families of the other women murdered by Sumter also absorbed the news. For them, it reopened their own grief, but it also offered answers that had eluded them for decades. The confirmation linked their stories, tying together threads that had floated separately through Boston for nearly half a century. It revealed a pattern. It revealed the scope of a man's violence. It revealed the failures of a system that had been too slow to evolve. For the people who had pressured the DA's office into re-examining the evidence, the revelation became a reminder of why persistence matters. Without Widmer's petitions, without Cooper's research, without the lawsuits and the records requests, the case might have continued gathering dust. It might have been written off as unsolvable. It might have faded into the type of cold case that people mentioned briefly in academic corridors before falling silent again. Instead, their questions brought the truth into the present. Becky Cooper would go on to write a book about her search for the truth, capturing not just the facts of the case, but the emotional landscape surrounding it, the rumors, the silences, the institutional walls, the hidden stories, the lives intertwined with Jane's. Her work became part of the case's legacy, offering a narrative that was neither sensational nor sanitized. It gave Jane a voice that had long been overshadowed by mystery. Michael Widmer, older by the time the case was solved, expressed both satisfaction and disappointment. Satisfaction that the truth had finally surfaced. Disappointment that it had taken so long and that so much resistance had stood in the way of transparency. He had lived with the memory of the case since his youth. Now, decades later, the answer came with the weight of a lifetime. In Cambridge, students living in the same neighborhoods where Jane once walked experienced a moment of collective reflection. The city had changed. The buildings had been renovated. the locks had improved, the culture of awareness had grown. But the truth of violence, its unpredictability, its proximity, remained the same. And somewhere inside the archives of the Cambridge Police Department, the box containing Jane's case file was resealed at last. Not as an unsolved mystery, but as a closed chapter marked by perseverance, tragedy, and eventual resolution. Yet even with the killer named, the echoes of that winter night never truly quieted. People still wondered whether Sumter had been responsible for the murder of Ada Bean. They wondered whether there were other victims lost to history, their stories buried beneath time and misclassification. They wondered what might have happened if DNA technology had emerged sooner, or if someone had pushed harder in the 1980s, or if the case had not been shrouded in secrecy for so long. The tragic truth is that for nearly 50 years, the answer to Jane's murder sat inside a vial of preserved biological evidence. Evidence that was repeatedly tested, but always just one technological breakthrough away from revealing the truth. The case was never unsolvable. It was simply unsolved. That realization brought comfort to some and agony to others. Comfort in knowing that the truth was real and achievable. Agony in knowing that it had been within reach for so long without being grasped. As the details of Sumter's life became public knowledge, patterns emerged that painted a portrait of a dangerous, volatile man. He had grown up in the Boston area, drifting between jobs, relationships, and arrests. His crimes escalated over time, beginning with assaults, then progressing into more violent acts. Each attack showed increasing confidence and cruelty. He was bold, daring, patient, and devoid of remorse. He blended into the urban landscape with a skill that made him invisible until he struck, and afterward, he faded back into the crowd. His death in 2001 closed the door on any possibility of confession. If he had lived longer, perhaps detectives could have questioned him. Perhaps families could have confronted him. Perhaps he could have filled in the blanks that remain even now. But the opportunity was gone. Instead, people were left with a file, a photo, a history, and a DNA match enough to know the truth, but not enough to understand the man fully. Still, for Jane's case, truth was enough. Her story, once tangled in rumor and silence, finally had an ending that belonged to science, to persistence, and to those who refused to let her memory be reduced to speculation. But endings, even when they arrive, often leave more shadows than light, and Jane's shadow stretched far beyond the walls of that fourth-floor apartment. Even with Sumter unmasked by science, the details of his movements on the night of Jane's murder remained lost to time, and the silence surrounding his motives was something no investigation could ever penetrate. He had walked through the world with a kind of anonymity that only predators understand, a quiet, slipping between shadows, between buildings, between opportunities. To the people who crossed his path, he was unremarkable, ordinary, a man you would pass on a sidewalk and forget seconds later. That forgettability, that invisibility, made him lethal long before anyone knew his name. People who lived in Cambridge during the winter of 1969 spoke years later about the strange, almost atmospheric unease that settled over the city after Jane's death. Something in the rhythm of the community changed. Women walked in pairs whenever possible. Apartment doors that had once been left unlocked during the day were suddenly bolted, wedged, or tied shut with makeshift security measures. Windows were double-checked. Fire escapes became something to fear rather than overlook. Even the simple act of walking home late at night became layered with caution and awareness. The university itself was forced to confront decades of negligence that had created the perfect environment for a crime like this to occur. The rundown buildings with malfunctioning locks, the inconsistent security, the outdated infrastructure, it all contributed to a landscape where danger could go unnoticed until it was too late. But change within academic institutions is slow, and in 1969, many voices calling for safety improvements were ignored or considered unnecessary. It would take years and multiple tragedies for the university to begin implementing meaningful reforms. Some professors in the archaeology department later admitted that the murder created an undercurrent of paranoia that lasted throughout the rest of that academic year. Students watched each other closely, friendships sharpened with unease. People questioned motives, questioned appearances, questioned coincidences. The knowledge that someone had been able to enter a student's apartment, kill her, and vanish without trace created a silent fracture in the trust that once existed among members of the program. But perhaps the most haunting transformation occurred inside the minds of the students who had taken their general exams the morning Jane failed to appear. Those exams represented the threshold between student life and the beginning of a scholarly career. For many in that cohort, the memory of that morning Jane's absence, the unanswered questions, the dread that set in as hours passed, became something permanently etched into their lives. What should have been a day defined by academic accomplishment became a day overshadowed by tragedy. Some of those students went on to become professors themselves, teaching the next generation of archaeologists. And in private conversations, they would sometimes mention Jane, not her murder, but her talent, her curiosity, the way she approached her work. Her name became a kind of quiet legend, not spoken formally, not discussed openly, but carried in memory by those who had shared classrooms and field sites with her. They remembered her not as a victim, but as a scholar whose life had been moving steadily towards something extraordinary. It wasn't until decades later, when journalists and authors began revisiting the case, that the public started to grasp the fullness of who Jane had been. Not the myth, not the rumor, not the ritual victim of sensational headlines, but the real person, the young woman who painted in the quiet hours of the evening, the student who worried about exams, the friend who shared sherry with neighbors, the scholar who loved ancient landscapes, the daughter who wrote letters home with warmth and humor. Her humanity had been overshadowed by the spectacle of her death, but as more people learned about her life, the narrative shifted, slowly, painfully. Truth replaced rumor, fact replaced speculation. Still, the years between 1969 and 2018 were long and heavy. For much of that time, the case was handled with a level of secrecy that bordered on obstruction. The DA's office repeatedly refused to release records, citing the Open Investigation Clause, even when the case had clearly gone dormant. Journalists who attempted to pry information loose were met with the same responses year after year. Releasing the files could compromise future legal proceedings. It didn't matter that there were no suspects. It didn't matter that no one had been charged. It didn't matter that the primary witnesses were aging or passing away. The silence became its own kind of story. People who studied transparency laws began questioning why Massachusetts was so resistant to releasing public records compared to other states. Cold cases across the country had been solved because files were opened, allowing fresh eyes to uncover details long overlooked. But in Jane's case, that access was always denied. The refusal fueled conspiracy theories. It fueled distrust. It fueled the belief that someone within Harvard or someone connected to the department was being protected. All of it stemmed from a simple refusal to say anything at all. When the DA's office finally submitted the preserved biological evidence for new DNA testing, the decision was wrapped not in the desire for justice, but in the desire to maintain legality. They needed to prove the investigation was ongoing to justify their refusal to release records. So they submitted the DNA again because it was a procedural requirement. That bureaucratic move one made for the sake of paperwork became the reason Jane's case was solved. As soon as the match to Sumter was confirmed, everything changed. Detectives revisited old witness statements, matching timelines and behaviors to Sumter's known patterns. The idea that he had followed Jane home was no longer speculation, it was the most logical explanation. He had been in the area. He had a history of approaching women alone at night. His crimes demonstrated a repeated pattern of gaining access to women's living spaces. And once inside, his violence escalated with terrifying speed. His presence in Cambridge during that period was not a mystery. He had ties to the city. He had lived in Boston neighborhoods that bordered the university area. He had relationships with women in the region. He had worked near locations that gave him visibility of foot traffic and apartment buildings. All of these details painted a picture that aligned almost perfectly with the reconstructed timeline of Jane's final night. The more the investigators pieced together, the more the story solidified into a chilling truth. Jane had been killed not because of anything she knew, or anything she studied, or anyone she loved. She had been killed because she existed in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Because a violent predator crossed her path. Because the universe of 1969 offered women very few protections beyond luck. In the aftermath of the announcement, the reactions from Cambridge residents were a mix of relief and discomfort. Relief that the truth had emerged. Discomfort that the killer had been someone who never appeared in rumors, never surfaced in whispers, never aligned with any of the theories that had circulated for decades. People had looked inward toward the academic community for answers. They had looked at professors, at classmates, at intellectual rivalries. But the real danger had come from outside the circle entirely. A stranger, a drifter, a predator moving through the city without being seen. It challenged people's assumptions about safety. It forced a reevaluation of where danger truly comes from. It reminded everyone that the most frightening threats are often not the ones we imagine, but the ones we don't see at all. Not long after the announcement, the media revisited the building at 6 University Road, though by then, it had been renovated, updated, transformed into something aesthetically similar but structurally different. None of the original doors remained. None of the old locks. The infamous fire escape had been replaced or updated. The heating system had been modernized. The past existed only in blueprints and memories. But for those who remembered the winter of 1969, the exterior updates did little to erase its history. The building remained a silent witness to the night Jane died, and walking past its windows carried a weight that newcomers to the city could never truly understand. Harvard, too, was forced to confront the case once more, not because of blame, but because of legacy. Students asked questions. Professors reflected publicly about the atmosphere decades earlier. Discussions emerged about the responsibility institutions hold in ensuring student safety. The case resurrected conversations about how universities handle crime, how they respond to fear, and how they choose or refuse to protect their communities. And somewhere, in rooms where administrators rarely go, archivists and librarians quietly noted how interest in Jane's life had surged again. Requests for information increased. Her name appeared in student essays, research projects, campus discussions. For the first time in decades, she was no longer a legend whispered about behind closed doors. She was a person being studied, remembered, honored. But even with the case closed, even with a name attached to the crime, even with scientific certainty in hand, a question remained, one that hovered over Cambridge like a chill in the air. Why Jane? Why that night? Why that apartment? Why that window? Why that moment between 12:30 and 2 in the morning? Some questions have answers written in evidence. Others remain locked forever inside the minds of those who commit violence. And because Sumter died long before the truth came to light, the threads of motive dissolved with him. All that remained was the aftermath. Yet for everyone who knew and loved Jane, the truth, however incomplete, was still a truth worth having. It broke the silence that had held their memories hostage. It gave shape to decades of uncertainty. It allowed the narrative to shift away from rumor and toward resolution. Her story, once buried beneath institutional silence and sensational headlines, was finally returned to something honest, something factual, something human. And that honesty became the foundation for her legacy. A truth that arrived late, but not too late to matter. The name that surfaced from the DNA match did more than identify a killer. It stripped away half a century of myth. It dismantled the stories built from fear and speculation. It released the archaeology department from the weight of suspicion. It silenced the conspiracies about rituals and rivalries. It restored Jane's narrative to what it always should have been. The story of a young woman whose life was taken by a predator who did not know her, did not care who she was, and did not belong anywhere near her world. The truth did not heal everything. It did not erase the ache that settled into her parents' lives, or the shock frozen in James's memory, or the hollow that formed inside the Mitchells the moment they opened her bedroom door. It did not undo decades of silence, or bring back the years that slipped by while the answers sat waiting in a vial of preserved evidence. But it did give shape to the darkness. It did give a name to the shadow that had loomed for so long. And sometimes, in the world of unsolved crimes, a name is the closest thing to justice time will allow. After the announcement, life in Cambridge went on the way. Life always does, quietly, steadily, with a kind of indifferent momentum. Students walked the same streets without knowing the history beneath their feet. The city breathed, changed, evolved. Buildings were renovated, neighborhoods transformed, faces replaced by new generations. But for the people who remembered that winter, the closure, however delayed, lifted something unseen. It allowed the story to rest. Jane's case was no longer a question mark, no longer a rumor, no longer a cautionary tale whispered across decades. It was now a solved homicide, pinned to a man whose life of violence had finally been unveiled by science long after his death. A man who never answered for what he did, but whose name can never again hide behind anonymity. This begins not with the revelation of a name, but with the strange, heavy quiet that settles into the life of every cold case once the truth finally rises to the surface. A quiet that is not relief, not celebration, not closure, but something far more complicated. Something that feels like standing at the edge of a dark field, finally spotting the shadowy figure that's been haunting you for years, only to realize the figure has already walked away, leaving no chance to confront it. For nearly 5 decades, people had imagined Jane's killer as someone she knew, or someone from her academic circle. Someone who drank the same coffee, walked the same campus paths, sat in the same classes. When the DNA pointed to Michael Sumter, the narrative dissolved in an instant. The monster had never belonged to her world at all. He had come from the outside, quiet, uninvited, unseen, and then vanished back into the chaos of Boston's city streets. But knowing who doesn't always answer the questions that matter most. In the months after the case was finally announced as solved, the people whose lives had been connected to Jane, some intimately, some distantly, some unknowingly, found themselves revisiting memories with a kind of clarity they had not experienced in years. The details returned gradually, like old photographs sliding slowly into focus. James remembered the last conversation he shared with Jane, the small talk, the nervous excitement about exams, the comfortable rhythm of two people who cared for each other. In the years that followed, he had replayed those memories countless times. Not because he believed he could change them, but because the mind clings to the final ordinary moments before everything fractures. Now, knowing the truth of how she died, those moments gained a new weight. They were no longer the prelude to a mystery, but the end of a life interrupted. For Don and Jill Mitchell, the announcement stirred a set of memories that had never faded. They had carried the burden of that afternoon for nearly 50 years, the knock at the door, the sickening smell of cold air mixing with the metallic trace of blood, the instinctive trembling that overtakes the body when it senses something deeply wrong. When Sumter's name was released, they sifted through the past with a quiet kind of grief, the kind that cannot be fully spoken aloud. They remembered the sherry they shared with Jane just hours before her death, her smile, her laugh, the way she left their apartment with a polite goodnight and an exaggerated sigh about exams in the morning. They remembered how normal she had seemed, how comfortable, how unaware. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part. The knowledge that somewhere between that goodbye and the moment she lay down to sleep, a predator had climbed the fire escape with a quiet, deliberate intention she never heard coming. For her classmates, many of whom were now retired professors, seasoned archaeologists, or respected scholars, the news brought back images of a winter unlike any other. Long-forgotten details resurfaced. The hushed conversations in hallways, the whispers exchanged behind closed office doors, the unspoken suspicion that someone among them might have been involved. Most of them had not liked carrying that suspicion. It had hung heavily over their program for years, creating fractures in trust that took time to heal. The revelation that the killer had been a stranger, a name none had ever spoken or even heard during their graduate years, released them from a shadow they had never deserved. Some felt guilt for ever believing the rumors. Others felt anger that the rumors had ever been allowed to grow in the first place. Many felt simple, unadorned sorrow, sorrow for the years Jane never got to live, sorrow for the career she never got to finish, sorrow for how easily violence can slip into the margins of an otherwise ordinary life. Her professors, those who were still alive when the announcement was made, struggled to describe the moment they learned the truth. Some said relief washed over them like cold water. Others said it felt like reopening a wound that had barely scabbed over. A few admitted that they had long suspected the truth lay far outside the orbit of the department, but they kept those suspicions quiet to avoid stoking more rumors. Now that the truth was undeniable, they found themselves revisiting their interactions with Jane, the way she asked questions, the way she debated respectfully, even when she disagreed, The way she carried herself with quiet confidence. They remembered her hand rising in crowded lecture halls. They remembered her bent over site maps, tracing timelines with focus. They remembered her walking across campus, with books pressed to her chest, her scarf wrapped around her neck against the winter wind. They remembered a young woman who had been more than a crime scene, more than a case file, more than a headline. And they mourned the decades she never saw. Beyond Jane's immediate world, the news also reached families of other victims linked to Sumter. For them, the names and details carried their own weight. They understood the strange conflict between closure and absence better than anyone. They knew what it meant to learn a truth that could not be addressed, a truth that could not be brought before a courtroom or cross-examined under bright lights. They knew what it meant to receive an answer without the possibility of justice. Some of them reached out to Jane's relatives. Others stayed silent, absorbing the connection privately. But regardless of whether they spoke aloud or not, there was a sense of shared understanding, a recognition that their loved ones had been part of the same terrible pattern, part of the same violent trajectory of a man who had walked through the world for far too long without being stopped. But one of the most unexpected reactions came from the Cambridge community itself. People who had lived in the city in the 1960s and 70s spoke about how the crime had become part of the collective memory of that era. Some remembered the fear that settled over neighborhoods after Jane's death. Others remembered hearing false rumors about professors or students. Some remembered walking past the building on University Road and feeling a strange chill even in the middle of summer. Now, with the truth revealed, they found themselves reassessing not just the case, but their own history of fear. The revelation forced many to confront an uncomfortable reality. The real danger had come not from within the academic world, but from the edges of society, from the very streets they walked every day. It had come from someone whose name they had never known, whose face they had never recognized, whose presence had been invisible until it was too late. In the years that followed the public announcement, the story of Jane's murder became more than a true crime case. It became a case study in the evolution of forensic science. It became an example of how critical DNA preservation is, how moments of luck and diligence can preserve key evidence long enough for technology to catch up. It became a story told in classrooms about the importance of not discarding biological material from unsolved cases. It became a reminder to investigators everywhere that patience, persistence, and willingness to revisit cold cases can change history. Researchers studying criminal justice reform cited the case as evidence of how institutional secrecy can hinder progress. Advocates for open records pointed to the decades-long struggle for transparency as a warning against allowing agencies to hide information behind vague claims of ongoing investigations. Transparency scholars wrote papers about the case. Students used it in theses. Lectures on cold case methodology referenced it as a defining example of why evidence should always be retested with each new technological advancement. Even outside academia, the story resonated in unexpected places. Artists created installations inspired by Jane's life. Writers explored her story in essays about memory and justice. Local historians highlighted her case as one of the most significant in Cambridge's criminal history. Book clubs discussed the literature inspired by her life. And in true crime circles, her case became a symbol of hope that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still emerge. But for the people closest to her, the case remained deeply personal. They spoke of her not in terms of tragedy, but in terms of potential. They spoke about the kind of archaeologist she would have become. They spoke about the people she might have mentored. They spoke about the work she never got to finish, the discoveries she never got to make, the contributions she might have brought to the world of anthropology. The more people spoke about who Jane had been, the more the public began to understand how deeply the case had been flattened by decades of rumor. The early reporting had taken her complexity and reduced her to a symbol of academic rigor, a symbol of vulnerability, a symbol of mystery. But she had been a person long before she became any of those things. A person with ambitions, anxieties, flaws, joys, hopes. A person who had painted late at night because it quieted her thoughts. A person who wrote letters home about the smallest details of her life because she wanted her parents to feel included. A person who studied ancient civilizations because she believed the past could teach us something meaningful about how life should be lived in the present. As the truth of the case resurfaced, people finally saw her again as she had once been. Not a legend, not a puzzle, but a 23-year-old woman who had been on the cusp of beginning the most important part of her career. A woman whose name had been carried through 5 decades, not by justice, but by a question mark. And yet, now that the question mark had finally been replaced by a period, the narrative widened in ways no one fully expected. People began asking how many other cases from that era, from that city, from that state, were waiting for a technological breakthrough. How many names were still trapped in the basement files of police departments, their truth preserved in some forgotten drawer? How many families were still waiting for answers that could be uncovered with a test that did not exist when the crime was committed? The answer, of course, was many. Jane's case was not just the story of a young woman taken too soon. It became the story of how time can erase leads, but not evidence. Of how science can breathe life back into a case long after the world has stopped looking. Of how the dogged persistence of ordinary people like Widmer, Cooper, and countless others who asked uncomfortable questions, can move institutions that have grown comfortable with silence. But even as the larger implications were recognized, the most intimate conversations remained quiet. They happened in living rooms, in phone calls between friends, in the private reflections of people who had lived through the aftermath. Some of Jane's former classmates spoke about the guilt they carried for the way suspicion once moved through the department. They recalled how rumors had formed like cracks in the walls, spreading quickly, dividing people who had once collaborated with ease. In the absence of answers, imagination had taken over. And imagination can be cruel. Some people were quietly judged for being strange, or distant, or overly intense. Others were scrutinized simply because they lived near the building or crossed paths with Jane. No one meant harm, but fear reshapes the human mind in ways that few want to acknowledge. Now, with the truth revealed, some reached out to one another, apologizing for unspoken judgments, acknowledging the weight of uncertainty that had warped their thinking in those early days. They weren't apologizing for any specific action. Most had done nothing wrong, but for the atmosphere of suspicion that had haunted their cohort. They apologized for the silence that filled the gaps between them, for the way trust had cracked under pressure. Her professors, too, carried their own quiet regrets, not because they believed they could have saved her, but because they had not fought harder for security improvements in the building. They remembered the meetings where concerns were dismissed as exaggerated, the discussions where faulty locks were brushed aside as minor maintenance issues, the awareness that the building was deteriorating, but not enough political leverage existed to make the necessary changes quickly. They remembered how, after Jane's death, the university took action, but only then, only after tragedy had forced its hand. And for some of them, that timeline haunted them more than anything else. Her family, although not alive to see the final breakthrough, left behind letters and notes that gave glimpses of their grief. People who read those letters later spoke of the heartbreak woven through each line. Her parents had believed, with the kind of hope only parents possess, that someday the truth would emerge. They had believed someone, somewhere, held the key. They had believed justice was possible, they just hadn't lived long enough to witness it. And that reality remains one of the most painful elements of the story. In the years between the murder and the eventual solution, the Britton family moved through life with a grief that shaped them quietly. They continued working, they continued writing, they continued contributing to academic circles, but the loss followed them everywhere. Friends described them as dignified, composed, and gentle in their sorrow, never bitter, never resentful, but unable to escape the shadow that had settled over their lives on a cold January afternoon. When the case was finally solved, distant relatives still living spoke about the ache of knowing the truth had arrived after her parents were gone. But they also spoke of the comfort in knowing the answer had not been buried forever. They believed her parents would have found a kind of peace in learning the truth that the murderer had not been someone Jane trusted, not someone within the circle of scholars she admired, not someone who shared her intellectual passions. The truth would have hurt, but it would have freed them from the burden of uncertainty. Other people affected by the case found themselves revisiting pivotal memories that now sharpened into focus with the revelation of Sumter's identity. Some remembered seeing unfamiliar faces in Harvard Square during that era, men who seemed to loiter too long, or who watched students walking home. Some remembered hearing strange sounds on fire escapes in the neighborhood. dismissing them at the time as winter wind or rusted metal. Others remembered the sense that the city had changed in the late 1960s, becoming slightly edgier, slightly more unpredictable, slightly more dangerous. Those memories, once vague, now carried new weight. And then there were the investigators. For the detectives who worked the case in the 1960s, the revelation in 2018 felt like a long-delayed answer to a question that had bothered them every day of their careers. Even those who had retired decades earlier spoke publicly about the moment they learned the killer's name. Some expressed sadness that the justice system of their time had lacked the tools necessary to solve the case sooner. Others expressed anger that the truth had been delayed for so long. One detective, who had been a young officer at the time of the murder, said he had spent years imagining the moment the case might finally be solved. He had pictured a courtroom, a confession, the closure of seeing a living suspect confronted with evidence. Instead, he received a name attached to a man who had died 17 years earlier. Yet, despite the lack of courtroom drama, many of them felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The unsolved cases sit in a particular part of the mind, heavy, unfinished, unresolved. To finally learn what happened, even decades later, is a rare gift in the world of law enforcement. The detective said that knowing the truth didn't erase the mistakes of the past, but it did allow the case to rest in a way it never had before. Younger detectives, those who inherited the case long after the original team retired, felt a different kind of reaction. They had grown up in a world where DNA was already an established part of forensic procedure. They had not lived through the era when fingerprints, interviews, and luck were the primary tools. To them, Jane's case was a reminder of how fortunate modern investigators are to have technology that can solve crimes once considered impossible. Still, even in the newer generation, there was an undercurrent of frustration. The retests in the 1990s and 2006 had not yielded a match, and in both cases, the DNA profile had been preserved carefully. The issue was not the quality of the evidence, but the limits of the database at the time. Had the breakthroughs of the 2010s arrived just a little earlier, perhaps the case could have been solved while more of the key people were still alive. But timing is a cruel thing. It gives as often as it takes. The most unexpected layer of emotion came from the people who had pushed hardest for transparency. They had not known Jane personally. They had not lived through the wave of fear that had swept Cambridge in 1969. They were not tied to the case by blood or friendship. They were tied to it by something else, a sense of responsibility to truth. A belief that stories like Jane's should not fade into silence simply because time has dulled their edges. For them, the announcement was both vindication and reminder. Vindication that their efforts had mattered, that asking questions had moved the needle. Reminder that institutions often protect themselves more fiercely than they protect truth. And reminder that justice delayed, while not justice denied, leaves a hollow space that cannot always be filled. As the reality of what happened to Jane Britton settled into the minds of everyone connected to her story, the city around her slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Snow melted, semesters turned, new students moved into apartments that once housed those who remembered her. The world changed in 1,000 ways that had nothing to do with her life or her death. And yet, her story remained tethered to the city's memory in a quiet, enduring way. The people who carried Jane with them did so in ways both large and small. Her former professors mentioned her name in nostalgic conversations about brilliant students from decades past. Some of her classmates spoke of her when mentoring their own students, offering her as an example of promise interrupted too soon. A few kept her letters, her notes, her handwriting preserved between the pages of old books, reminders of a winter that never fully left them. Sometime after the revelation, a former colleague reflected that the hardest part was not the years of silence, it was the sudden clarity that arrived when science finally provided an answer. It made him realize how fragile the boundary between safety and danger had always been, how the illusion of control could vanish in a single night. Jane's death had taught an entire generation of students that vulnerability exists even in the most familiar spaces, that danger can slip through the smallest gaps, a broken lock, an open window, a moment of exhaustion that quiets the instincts. But alongside that realization came something else. The understanding that truth, no matter how delayed, has its own kind of power. It reshapes memory. It settles questions that have echoed too long. It allows the living to reframe their grief, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. The truth did not bring Jane back. It did not change the outcome of that winter night. It did not undo the years of sorrow her family endured, or the shadows that settled over her department. But it offered something that had been withheld for too long, an end to the question of who took her life. And in that end, there was a kind of gentleness, small but real. People began to speak about Jane less as a figure frozen in tragedy, and more as the young woman she truly was. They remembered her vibrant curiosity, the earnest way she debated ideas, the spark in her when she spoke about ancient cultures, the way she could lose herself in painting for hours. They remembered the small kindnesses, the shared jokes, the long nights studying, the way she moved through her world with intention and warmth. Her story, once overshadowed by rumor and silence, belonged to her again. And in the quiet that followed, the city seemed to acknowledge her presence, still felt, still remembered, still woven into the fabric of a winter long past. Those who walked by the building on University Road sometimes felt an instinctive heaviness, not of fear, but of memory. A reminder that lives can change in a moment, that justice may arrive decades too late, and that some stories take half a lifetime to reach their truth. The closing of this chapter did not feel like triumph. It felt like breath returning after a long hold. It felt like a door finally shutting, not loudly, but gently, with the soft click of something finally at rest. Jane's life did not end in mystery anymore. It ended in truth. And sometimes, after so long, truth is the closest thing we have to justice. The years that followed the public revelation of Jane Britton's killer brought a strange, bittersweet stillness to the people who had lived in the orbit of her story. The silence that once clung to the case like a thick winter fog no longer carried weight. It no longer hid anything. It no longer demanded interpretation. The silence had shifted from secrecy to something else entirely: reflection. People who had not spoken about Jane in decades found themselves suddenly remembering her vividly, as if the truth had unlocked a door that memory had quietly kept closed. A former classmate described it as though the news had pulled her back into the room, alive in the mind again, with a small, familiar details returning first. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she pursed her lips when she was concentrating, the way she rubbed the bridge of her nose when she was anxious about deadlines. For years, those memories had been blurred by the enormity of her death. But now, freed from speculation and suspicion, they resurfaced with clarity. It was strange how truth did that, how it unfroze pieces of the past. The archaeology department, once weighed down by whispers of ritualistic claims and unfounded accusations, found itself breathing differently. Professors who had avoided discussing the case with students either out of discomfort or out of fear of feeding old rumors now spoke of Jane with openness. They told stories about her intelligence, her fieldwork in Iran, her enthusiasm for ancient cultures, her kindness toward first-year students who felt overwhelmed in their early courses. She had been a bright presence in their program, someone who could be trusted to ask insightful questions and offer thoughtful interpretations, someone who contributed not only academically but emotionally to the community. Her name appeared on internal memorial lists, mentioned in essays by students examining historic cold cases, quoted in academic discussions about the intersection of archaeology and gender. Some used her story as a lens through which to examine how young women navigated academia in the late 1960s, a time when departments were overwhelmingly male, when expectations were rigid, and when opportunities were unevenly distributed. Jane had been part of a generation pushing forward, carving space, claiming their right to pursue scholarship on the same level as their male colleagues. Her loss had been more than personal. It had been symbolic, too, a reminder of how fragile progress could be. Across the years, her story took on a shape larger than the tragedy alone. It became a discussion about safety, about institutional accountability, about the consequences of ignoring basic security concerns. People outside academia began to point to her case as an example of how vulnerable students can be when institutions overlook the risks of urban campuses, especially in older buildings with faulty infrastructure. It raised questions about how many tragedies might have been prevented with simple changes, sturdier locks, functioning windows, regular building maintenance, proper security personnel. But for those who remembered Jane personally, those questions were not theoretical. They were raw, real, painful. They remembered her speaking about the heat in the building, how the radiators made her apartment too warm even in the dead of winter. They remembered how she left her windows cracked open sometimes to cool the air, even as the cold wind cut across Cambridge. They remembered her joking about how the building seemed older than the artifacts she studied. They remembered her mentioning the strange noises from the fire escape footsteps, vibrations, the occasional thud against the exterior wall. Normal city sounds, they thought then. Ordinary, harmless. Only in hindsight did those details become fractures in the timeline. As the public absorbed the truth, people who had lived in Cambridge during that era began sharing old anecdotes. Some spoke of the atmosphere in the city between 1968 and 1970, an atmosphere shaped by national turmoil, political unrest, shifting social landscapes, and a growing sense that danger lived closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. Many of them recalled how women often walked with keys between their fingers, how they learned to glance over their shoulders, how they memorized which streetlights flickered and which corners felt safe. Women who had been students at Harvard and Radcliffe back then said that Jane's death had changed the way they moved through the city. They avoided back stairwells. They stopped leaving windows unlocked. They shared their class schedules with their closest friends, so someone always knew where they should be at any given moment. They formed informal buddy systems for nighttime walks across campus. For some, the habits never left. Decades later, they still avoided stairwells, still double-checked their locks, still scanned the darkness before stepping inside their homes. These patterns testified to the long-lasting impact of a single, senseless act carried out in a building with creaking floors and poorly secured windows on a cold night in early January. Meanwhile, journalists revisiting the case discovered that the silence maintained by the Middlesex District Attorney's Office in the decades following the murder had not only contributed to widespread misinformation, it had also created a vacuum where fear and fiction flourished. In the absence of answers, stories had filled the space. Sensational stories, incorrect stories, stories that implicated innocent people, cast suspicion on entire departments, and wove ancient symbolism into a crime that had none. With the truth now established, some journalists apologized publicly and privately for the role the press had played in distorting the narrative. Not all of them, of course. But the ones who recognized the impact of those early headlines understood how deeply they had shaped public opinion. One even remarked that the red ochre rumor had been too compelling for its own good, a detail that became a wildfire because it was dramatic, intriguing, and unexpected, a detail that overshadowed everything else, even though it had been nothing more than a pigment used by a young artist who lived alone in a drafty Cambridge apartment. In the years after the case was solved, a quiet pilgrimage formed among true crime enthusiasts and curious students. Some walked past 6 University Road, looking up at the windows and imagining the world as it had been in 1969. They stepped onto the sidewalk with reverence, not out of spectacle, but out of respect for what had happened and for the woman whose life had been reduced to a question for far too long. Others visited archives, scanning old newspaper clippings, searching for letters Jane had written, looking for some trace of who she was beyond the case. The more people learned, the more they felt connected to her, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a person. A young woman far from home, living in a building filled with students and noise and life. A student juggling research, exams, friendships, anxieties, excitement. A scholar standing at the threshold of her future. And for many, that human connection became the true legacy of her case. Not the name of her killer, not the rumors that once surrounded her death, not the dramatic narratives that overshadowed her story for decades, but the understanding that behind every headline is a life full of detail, meaning, and potential. In that understanding, her memory found a place to settle, a place rooted not in tragedy, but in truth. Even as the city evolved and decades slipped by, something about Jane's story remained suspended in Cambridge's collective memory. It was not just the unresolved fear that once lived there, or the rumors that circled through academic halls, but the sense that something unfinished had always lingered over that winter night. When the truth finally emerged, and the name of her killer was spoken aloud, that unfinished feeling softened. But it did not disappear. It transformed. It became reflection. People who had lived through the case realized that closure and understanding are not the same thing. Closure means an ending. Understanding means absorbing the ending into the fabric of your life. Those who remembered her, her teachers, her classmates, Her neighbors found themselves navigating both processes at once. One of her former classmates described it best. He said that for years, the memory of Jane's death had been like a sharp edge in his mind, something he tried not to touch because it hurt when he did. But when the case was solved, the edge remained, only now it was smoother. Still painful, still weighty, but softened by clarity. He could finally hold it without bleeding. Another classmate wrote in her journal years later that the news made her feel something she had never been able to articulate before. I finally know how to grieve her. She had spent decades thinking of Jane as a question, a mystery, a story interrupted at the worst possible moment. But when the truth arrived, Jane became a person again, fully, completely, unambiguously. Someone she had studied beside, someone she had laughed with, someone whose absence had long been felt but never fully understood. Jane's life, once overshadowed by speculation, became a story reclaimed. And in that reclamation, people allowed themselves to remember things they had forgotten. The warmth of her presence, the way she lit up when talking about ancient civilizations, the sherry she sipped with friends on winter nights, the small comments she made about exam nerves, the quiet jokes she shared during long study sessions. None of these memories were extraordinary on their own, but together they painted a portrait of a young woman who had been much more than the tragedy that followed her name. Her family's remaining relatives spoke about how the truth, though delayed, allowed her legacy to breathe again. They said that knowing the facts did not erase the pain, but it did bring a sense of belonging back to her story. Her life returned to the people who loved her, instead of staying trapped in the realm of rumor and myth. Even the investigators, who had long since retired, acknowledged the emotional shift. Some said that every unsolved case leaves a knot in the chest, tight, immovable, frustrating. When Jane's killer was identified, that knot loosened. Not undone, but loosened. Enough for breath to pass through. Enough for the mind to stop returning to the same dead ends. Enough for the heart to accept that the answers had finally surfaced. In the quiet aftermath of the revelation, the significance of the case reached farther than anyone expected. It became a story journalists referenced when explaining why cold cases should never be abandoned. It became an example used in legal debates about open records and government transparency. It became a symbol for how perseverance, even from ordinary citizens, can push institutions to act. It became a reminder that justice may sleep, but it does not vanish. And for many in Cambridge, it became part of the city's emotional geography. A piece of history woven into the brick and cobblestone streets, whispered through generations of students who came long after Jane, but felt something when they learned her name. Something heavy, but not hopeless. Something tragic, but not empty. People who walked past her former building said the air around it felt different after the truth came out. Not haunted, not frightening, just quieter. Like a story that had been waiting for its ending and finally received it. In that quiet, there was acknowledgement not only of what was lost, but of what was finally understood. Jane's death had once been swallowed by speculation, silenced by secrecy, and distorted by sensationalism. Now, at last, her story stood on the foundation of truth. Her identity, her life, her humanity had risen above the myths. And in the end, the weight of the case settled where it always should have been, on the shoulders of the man who committed the crime, not on the people who loved her, studied with her, or simply lived in the wrong building at the wrong time. The truth did not erase the past, but it illuminated it. And with that illumination, the story finally reached a place of rest. As the final weeks of reflection unfolded, everyone connected to Jane's life, whether through memory, rumor, or rediscovery, seemed to circle around the same quiet realization. Some stories endure not because of their tragedy, but because of the lives they remind us to honor. Jane's story had never belonged to the cold silence of unsolved crime. It belonged to her parents, who cherished her curiosity. It belonged to James, who carried her memory through years of unanswered questions. It belonged to her classmates, who remembered the warmth she carried into every room she entered. It belonged to the professors, who saw in her the beginnings of a remarkable career. And it belonged to everyone who chose to look past the sensational headlines and see the promise she embodied. With the truth of what happened to her finally laid bare, the weight that pressed down on the community began to ease, not all at once, but gradually, like ice thawing under a slow morning sun. For many, The justice they had long hoped for didn't come in the form of a trial or a sentence. It came in the form of recognition, acknowledgement, certainty. The knowledge that her story would no longer be held hostage by speculation. Her legacy settled into Harvard's history with a new kind of reverence. Jane was no longer just the subject of a decades-old mystery. She was a reminder of resilience, of persistence, of how truth can outlast silence. Her memory was no longer overshadowed by the darkness of what happened to her, but illuminated by the truth that had finally come for her. And in that final shift from myth to truth, her story found its place. Not as an unresolved question, but as a life remembered. The winter of 1969 finally loosened its grip. And what lingered afterward was not the violence of her final moments, but the enduring imprint of the young woman who came before them. Time has a way of carrying stories forward, long after the people within them have left the world behind. Jane's story traveled through 5 decades, whispered, misremembered, reshaped, buried, revived, until it finally settled where it always belonged, in the truth. When the news of the solved case faded from the headlines, life continued its slow movement forward. New students moved into dorms Jane once walked past. Young archaeologists read her name in textbooks about cold cases and forensic breakthroughs. Her friends aged, her professors retired, her classmates grew older. But each time her story was told, it carried the power of something larger than tragedy. It carried the reminder that no matter how much time passes, a truth preserved is a truth that can eventually be found. The people who pushed to reopen her file did not know her personally, but their persistence acted as a bridge between generations, reconnecting Jane to a world that had nearly forgotten her. The investigators who worked the case long after her death carried a different burden: the knowledge that justice would never reach the man who took her life, yet refusing to let the case fade quietly into the past. When the truth surfaced, it rippled outward, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet force of something that had waited patiently for years. In the end, the legacy of Jane Britton was not defined by the violence that took her life, but by the lives she touched, the memories she left behind, and the determination of those who refused to let her disappear into the shadows of an unsolved crime. Her story became a testament to science, to resilience, and to the enduring belief that closure, though sometimes delayed, is still possible. And as the final chapter of her case came to rest, one truth remained unwavering. Jane was more than the mystery that surrounded her. She was a daughter, a scholar, a friend, a young woman full of promise. And now, at last, her story ends in clarity, not silence. Justice did not reach the man who harmed her, but truth did. And sometimes, truth is the final light a life deserves. Thank you for watching this long, haunting journey with me. If you felt the weight of Jane's story, if you want more cases uncovered with this level of care, depth, and truth, make sure you like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Disturbed Intent. Your engagement helps us bring forgotten stories back into the light. Share this video, honor her memory, and as always, stay safe, stay observant, and I'll see you in the next investigation.